Ask me. Thank you.
What is it?
I was just introducing myself.
Mr. Shawn McCauley.
Thank you for coming here. This is a bigger turnout than I expected. This is added pressure on me, both from the number of people in the room and 2 different cameras going, and I'm tethered to this microphone, and I'm kind of worried about falling down, but we'll do the best that we can. This lecture series is one of my favorite things on this entire campus. Being able to, not just to participate in, but to come. I always try to attend as many of them as I can. It's a great opportunity to see faculty and staff, just to see representatives of Barton College outside sort of their normal context. So you're not taking a class with me, but we can come together in this space and talk about some interesting things. It gives us opportunity to talk about things that we don't often or always get a chance to within the scope of sort of our normal responsibilities. So looking around, I see some faces from the classes that I'm teaching this semester. Some are in the honors class, some are in Shakespeare, some I've had classes with before. Since this is a blueprint event, though, you may just be here and you have no idea who I am or what I do here or what on earth I am going to talk about, and that is good. That is a fundamentally good thing for you to be in a space where you don't know exactly what's going on. This handout we'll get to in a minute. Y'all did the thing that students do, which is great, of as soon as you're presented with information, you looked at it and you started trying to make sense of it, right? Without waiting for a framework for doing so. That's sort of what this talk is intended to be, is just to walk through some of the stuff on the handout. I decided not to do PowerPoint slides and all of that stuff. We'll make do with a good old piece of paper. You have seen an elephant before in your life. Why am I presenting you with a picture of one? There's a story. It's a Hindu myth, and depending on if you make changes to it, it goes all the way back to anywhere from 500 BCE to maybe 1000 BCE. But there's a story about the elephant in the village full of blind people. So in this story, there's a village and there are blind people in it, and one day a traveler comes through the town with an elephant in tow. And everybody in the village is freaking out. This is a big deal. It's like a remote mountain thing. They don't get much in the way of entertainment there. And there's like 6 blind guys that hear what is going on, so they go out into the street to try to get a sense of something big is happening. What is it? And the other townsfolk tell them, oh, there's an elephant. And they've never seen an elephant. They've never encountered one. They don't have the internet. They have no conception of what an elephant is. And so all 6 of them, they ask the permission of the merchant who's making his way through the town if they can go and put their hands on this creature so that they can see what it feels like. And the way that the story goes is that one of the blind men goes up and puts his hand on the side of the elephant and feels its wrinkly skin and says, oh, I know what an elephant is. An elephant is a wall. Feel how rough and how sturdy it is. Meanwhile, the guy beside him has missed sort of the flank of the elephant and has come up and grabbed a hold of the elephant's leg and says, well, now what are you talking about? It's rough like the bark of a tree and stout, and you can wrap your arms around it. Obviously, an elephant is like a tree. And then there's a guy hanging around in the back, and he encounters the elephant's tail and says, no, you're both wrong. It's not a wall. It's not a tree. An elephant is like a broom. It's stiff, and it's got this little tuft on the end of it, and it's swaying back and forth. Like, how could you possibly miss that? Then around the front of the elephant, somebody grabs hold of its trunk and says, no, you're both wrong. All of you are wrong. An elephant is like a snake. And another guy grabs the elephant's tusk and says, what are you talking about? Rough and smooth and a broom and all of this stuff. It's smooth and straight, and it has a point on the end. An elephant is obviously a spear. And then the elephant rides out of town, and the blind guys devolve into a furious argument over what this thing is that they just encountered. The story is often used as a way to explain like the importance of seeing the big picture. Like you need to resist the temptation to only view things through your own personal little narrow window of observation and experience onto the world, which is right. But I think it's also a really interesting story, both in the light of this lecture series as a whole and in sort of my particular piece of it that I'm going to walk you through today, which is that even though all of these guys are wrong to some degree, at least they're all basing what their conclusions are on some sort of evidence, right? They don't just go up and say, hear people talking about the elephant and say, oh, an elephant is like a cat because I really like cats and cats are cool and elephants are cool. They're going and directly interacting with the thing and using whatever little piece of it that they've come in contact with as a basis for that interpretation, for that evaluation, for building that knowledge about this thing that they have encountered. I think at some level, that's exactly what this class is. You've got me up here today. I'm going to talk to you about pressure. And then next week, somebody else is going to come in and talk about something drastically different, but that is still connected to that particular topic. And then the week after that, somebody else will come in. And by the end of the semester, you'll have a dozen different, if you're one of the honor students in the classes, a dozen or so different perspectives on what exactly pressure means. What I want to talk about it is in the context of poetry. I teach English classes here, and this semester I'm teaching Shakespeare. Last semester I taught sort of the poetic literature criticism class. And one of the things that I encounter over and over and over again with students is the reluctance to engage concretely with specific parts of what it is that they're reading. And I think this is an incredibly valuable skill for you to have, even if you're not taking a poetry class, even if you're not reading poetry on your own, even if you're not reading words on a page, but just whenever you are encountering things in your life, whether they're texts, whether they're visuals, whether they're other human beings, to try to anchor that in some portion of reality. So I've included a poem here. It's one of my favorite poems by one of my favorite poets. He's a former poet laureate of the United States. His name is Billy Collins. And underneath the elephant there is this poem, Introduction to Poetry. I'm just going to spend a couple minutes on it. The title by itself could mean several different things. It could mean this poem is going to be an introduction to poetry. It could mean, like many colleges, there is a course that exists called Introduction to Poetry. And students come in and they sit in seats like this and somebody talks to them and tries to explain to them what poetry is. He says, I ask them, and them here is those students in this hypothetical class. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a colored slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. Or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. And this, I think, what he's getting at here is very often with college students when they're encountering poetry in a class, sort of the way that an unfortunately large percentage of them get taught to read poetry in high school or even before is, here's a thing, it is confusing, it is indirect, it is ambiguous. There is a correct answer. There is a way to interpret it, and you have to break out your secret decoder ring and try to figure out what that meaning is, and you're going to be tested on it, right? So you read, Pose the Raven, and then you're supposed to know certain things about it, and you take a test, and you either get those questions right or you get them wrong. And his approach to this, and the approach that I like to sort of try to take in my courses as well, is the opposite of that. Your job is not to interrogate these words, to try to tie them down to just one specific meaning. The brilliant thing about poetry, which is also the aggravating thing about poetry, is the way that it revels in ambiguity, that it can mean 7 different things simultaneously. So sort of like that elephant, which yes, is one living creature, it can be interpreted in as many different ways as there are people. Again, the catch here is that whatever interpretation you come up with needs to be rooted in the actual language of the poem as opposed to something that you just invented out of thin air. So that's the purpose sort of Billy Collins here in Introduction to a Poetry. It's not this CIA Guantanamo Bay approach to reading, it's linger. It's enjoy the fact that not everything is clear-cut, that people and their emotions and their experiences are complex and can be interpreted in a number of different ways. So on the other side, this is there's a story, it's attributed to Ernest Hemingway, that he had a bet with some other writers. Ernest Hemingway is famous for being a very minimalist author, giving you just the bare amount that you need in order for the story to progress. And allegedly he had a bet with some other writer friends of his who said, I bet you can't write a story that's only one sentence long. And Hemingway went, wrote for a little while, came back and said, okay, I got you, 6 words. And if you go and you look up on the internet, there are hosts of these things, both by professional writers and by people like yourselves that just submit them online. If you're in the 350 class, I'm going to ask you to come up with one for when we meet later this week. 6 words. Can you tell a story in 6 words? And Hemingway allegedly cranks this thing out. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. And there's 2 kinds of people in this world. There's people that read this and immediately go, that's the saddest thing that I've ever read in my entire life. That poor, poor baby, that poor, poor mother. Obviously, this baby has died under tragic circumstances. And now, for whatever reason, whether it is to raise money to pay for the funeral, if it's just that she doesn't want to have a reminder of this wound in her living space, this parent has now decided to sell these shoes. And nowhere in those words does it say any of that. This could be, for all you know, a classified ad in the newspaper of somebody just bought some baby shoes and they're the wrong size and they can't return them because they don't have the receipt anymore, so you want some baby shoes? Good condition, I'll give you a good price. Both of those interpretations are equally valid. People tend to the first one because it's so richer emotionally. But there's nothing really in here that says, no, this is exactly what it means and it must be interpreted in this way. I gave you a couple other ones just because I think they're fun. Megan's baby, John's surname, Jim's eyes. Surname is a last name. It's Megan's baby, John's surname, Jim's eyes. And you may immediately jump and say, oh, well, there's some kind of an affair going on here, right? Does John know? Is Jim the mailman? Is Jim the neighbor? Is Jim John's brother? Like what? Something's going on here. Call Jerry Springer to give you a really dated reference. That's a valid interpretation. A completely different one is this is a gay couple who have a surrogate that is having their child. And they got married, one man took the other man's last name, and they have decided to have a child. They brought Megan, whoever she is, into the situation, and so it's gonna have the one dad's name, but it's gonna have the other dad's eyes, right? Those are just 2. There's an infinite number of other things, but it has to be rooted in the text. Last one, Orson Scott Card. Please, this is everything, I swear. Just think for a second. Like, what's the context there? It's so tough. There's only 6 words. There's so much missing. Who's talking? Who are they talking to? Why are they talking? All the usual apparatus that we expect of a story is missing from this. One potential answer is this person is being mugged. Right? Please, you got my wallet, you got my phone. Please, this is everything, I swear. Just let me make it home to my family. That's one thing, right? It could be somebody in the Walmart parking lot who's asking for $5 from a stranger who just walked by to get gas money, to get to where his family is at, to be able to take care of them. Please, this is everything, I swear. Like, this means everything to me. Those are completely different interpretations. Again, to loop back to this idea that interpretation is an act of applying pressure. I say this when I first got the topic of, okay, the theme this year is going to be pressure. What does that mean for somebody who teaches literature? And the phrase that immediately popped into my head is the one from my title up there about interpretive pressure. That's something that I tell my students to do a lot, right? Put a little more pressure on this. Put a little more pressure on the language. I don't know if they know what I mean. I don't know if I need to do something like this at the beginning of classes, even if it is Shakespeare's 300 level, just to remind students of what it is that I mean by that. And what I mean is perhaps best captured in this poem at the end. It's by Theodore Roethke, called My Papa's Waltz. It's a very famous poem. You may have encountered it at some point in high school. But you read through this thing and it says, "The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy. But I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt." And so I think we all agree that there's a father and there's a child, and maybe we can assume it's a son since it's Theodore is writing the poem, but that's not always a safe assumption. But let's just say this is a son and the father is putting him to bed. What are we supposed to take away from this poem? What does it mean in the end? Why is he talking about this? And so we start asking questions about the father and the son and the relationship and what exactly is going on. And again, there's sort of two kinds of people in the world. There's people that see this and read this poem and think, like, what a happy memory. Like, I personally have memories of that, of, okay, it's time to go to bed and you're a little kid and you don't really want to go. And so your dad gets up and does the thing where you're little enough where you can stand on the tops of his feet. And then just 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, off into the bedroom, I'm going to drop you off. And there's signals in this poem. There's concrete evidence that we can use to support that interpretation, right? A waltz, you tend to think of as being a positive dance, right? Just again, that uplifting beat of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's not some sad, somber kind of occasion. Hanging on like death, like, you know, just they're spinning so fast that the kid has to hang on very tight or he's going to get spun sort of away by the force of his father playing around and roughhousing with him. The word romped, right, has a very positive connotation of just playing. Back in the day, houses had romper rooms that you could just send the kid into with the toys. So the romping, he's clinging to the shirt. There are all these things that we can sort of stack up one on top of another and say, this is a son who loves his father. This is a father who loves his son. He's putting him to bed as a good father does. It's one of those, you know, fleeting moments of just got home from a long day at the office, got to go back to work tomorrow, but I get a few minutes with my kid. And it's this combination of both the words that are here on the page and perhaps things from your personal experience that are kind of combining together. Your own history, your own relationship, your own parents. Directly alongside that, there's this other interpretation that if you look at the words, and this is what I really mean by interpretive pressure, it's pay attention to specific words and specific meanings and how they fit into the larger picture of things. Because although there are a number of positive words in this poem, there are some that are not. Whiskey, dizzy, death, right? Yes, that is a phrase that, you know, can just be, oh, I hung on like death. But death itself is not a positive thing, right? At least from a child's perspective, most likely. The mother standing there frowning, right? My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself, seeing what's transpiring. Is she reacting just to the fact that, oh, you clumsy boys, you just knocked over all my dishes? Or is there something else going on here? The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. Battered. The poet could have picked any word on the earth, and he picked the word battered, which has a very specific context in the meaning of a home, right? We think about like battered women's shelters, right? And battered children. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. That makes sense. Little kid standing on the feet, dancing around, buckles scraping his ears. But we're also thinking about, what's attached to that buckle is a belt. So maybe this is a home in which discipline is handed out in a very old school sort of variety. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. A completely different interpretation of this poem is that this dad is beating up on this kid. This is not the first time it's happened. It's not the last time that it will happen. This is an alcoholic father who has just come home, is under the influence, and is taking out whatever frustrations he may or may not have on this poor little kid. And that interpretation of a father abusing his child and this other interpretation of just a happy dance on the way to the bedroom both exist right there, side by side, next to one another. Both of them are equally true. We don't know. We could have gone and asked Retke, what exactly did you mean by this, right? But that's not how poetry works. It's on our shoulders as readers, as an audience, to try to put in work, apply some pressure to this text, to the words of which it is composed, and then generate a meaning out of it. And I think the overall meaning it's somewhere in between. Lots of us, if we look back on our relationships with our parents, there is love there is positivity, there is also some negative stuff, right? And I don't know all the ins and outs of Retke's upbringing and what his relationship with his father was like. I honestly don't really care all that much, because I'm not trying to figure out what did the poem mean to him. I'm trying to figure out what does it mean to us. Sitting here in a room, 2022, reading this poem, what is the meaning that we are creating out of it? So as you go off, either back to your classes or prepping for Honors 350, if you could take anything away, I hope it's this idea of just taking the time to really think about context. If it's a context of communication, to think about the words that you are writing, that you are speaking, or that you are reading, or that you are hearing. If it's a context of learning, to think about what is going on in there and what am I taking away from this? Both in the sense of how do these disparate pieces add up to this overarching whole, and like what's the grounding for them? Because I think you really need both of those things in order to not just to read a poem, but to be a person, right? It's not a big step away from this to recognizing the fact that the world is filled with people that are different from yourselves, that have different ideas, that have different opinions, that have different interpretations. And that is all well and good as long as they're rooted in something. Because otherwise it's impossible to have a conversation about it, right? It's frustrating when you're in a conversation with somebody and you say, well, I just think what I think. Okay, but why do you think that? Like, what's the rationale for it? What's the basis? I'm not asking about what you feel, I'm asking about what you think. And you should be able to back that up with something. Thank you. Thank you on time. Close. I'm happy to take any questions. Yes, sir.
So let's say there's like a group of doctors in a room. Instead of reading a poem, they're reading like results from blood work.
Absolutely.
And they all have different interpretations. Like they can't just say, okay, agree to disagree and walk away. Like obviously, one of the interpretations is going to be correct. So like would you say in some situations, having multiple interpretations can be destructive?
It absolutely can be if nothing comes of it, right? That's the danger of, not to get too in the weeds, but sort of one of the things I'm doing here is a strain of criticism called reader response, which says like there's an infinite number of readers, there's an infinite number of meanings, whatever. I can't tell you that a text means something different, right? Like you say, oh, this is very sad. I say, no, it doesn't make you sad. Who am I to say that? And that's the criticism of reader response is that, okay, so what? What does it go? If all interpretations are valid, then what do you end up with at the end of it? It's nothing. Your example is a good one because you would want something productive to come out of that. My response would be, you do have that sort of paralysis by analysis. There's 10 people in the room, all with 10 different opinions, and they all say, well, all our opinions are equally valid, and the patient dies in the background, right? It's equally as dangerous for one person to come in, look at that chart, look at the blood work, look at the data and say, oh, it must be this, and just go with it, right? Ideally, there's some place in between those two things where alternative viewpoints are considered. They may be rejected, but there's a basis for doing that, right? Which can't be, well, I think the patient just has the flu. Well, why do you think that? It's just a hunch, right? I would hope a doctor wouldn't do that. It's interesting you talk about the blood work too, because there's a saying that says, what is it? There's lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? That's can be a move that people will make is just say, well, I've got data here, I've got numbers. That is an interpretive process, is to try to figure out what do the numbers mean in this particular context. So I think that's a good question.
In that last poem, kind of touched on two different types of interpretations, like one being positive, one being negative. When looking at mental and physical aspects of health, do you think that taking things out of context can make it like a messy situation to try to act upon?
Can you explain just a little bit more, like an example?
So in the poem, one of the examples was an alcoholic father beating his child, and we kind of made that interpretation based on words in the poem. So if looking at, say, in a health situation, like someone coming in injured in the ER, how they always ask, like, how's your third leg? Does that make sense?
Yes, no, absolutely. I'll respond with a specific example. When my daughter was like 6, I think, she was at my parents' house and they were playing out in the yard, like riding in a big wheel with her cousins. And somehow she got flipped out the back of it and broke her collarbone. And, she's 6, and we were trying to, calm her down and keep her distracted and stuff. And we were talking about, do you know the name of the bone that you broke? Like on the way to the hospital, we're talking about a clavicle and stuff. And then we get to the hospital, and the staff there, okay, so what happened here? Well, blah, 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 blah. Okay, little girl, can you tell us what happened? I broke my clavicle. And they just thought that we had coached her up, that we were abusing that child, and that we had just got all our facts straight before we went in there. So we weren't just, oh, well, she fell down the stairs kind of a thing, right? Context matters. I think that's the other piece of it, right? It's very easy, sort of with the elephant stuff, to come back and say, oh, the guy who said that the elephant is a fan is wrong. No, from his point of view, from his perspective, and based on the evidence that he has, that's 100% right. But he only has a piece of that context. And it's the job, if somebody just goes into the doctor and says, oh, my throat hurts. Okay, well, why? What have you been doing? Is it just that you have COVID, or is it that you've just, started a metal band? Like, what is it that might be contributing to this? Absolutely.
We have time for maybe one more question.
So I really appreciate you saying the context matters and thinking about pressure. There's a lot of pressure we all face nowadays because we have such divergent political interpretations of things that are happening, whether it's the pandemic or whatever. But I'm going that we live in this unique situation. I'm not sure there's a question about here, by the way. Just maybe a
Okay.
We live in a situation now where people can choose their context, right? So you choose the context, you choose the source that you're listening to, what you watch on TV, what you read. What's our responsibility? Not only as the Barton College, but as these students, to broaden that context?
I think my hope is that one of the outcomes of being here at Barton, regardless of what your major is or what courses you're taking, and I'm not just saying this as director of Gen Ed, but is that you ask questions and you recognize the limitations of your own perspective, right? And are able to engage in dialogue in meaningful ways with people who may have a different perspective, right? Because that's the thing that short circuits it all in our culture today seems to be like, okay, well, I watch this channel to get my news, or I'm in this Facebook group or this subreddit, and I do this other one, and so therefore we just can't even talk, right? It's that inability to communicate about stuff, right? And I think that's the importance of being able to anchor whatever that interpretation is, right? Beyond just, oh, well, I saw it on CNN. Okay, well, that guy who was talking about it on CNN, where is he getting his facts, his figures, his data, his statistics, right? As an educated person, I think that sort of both your responsibility as well as the sort of skill that you develop while you're in the process of becoming educated is being able to take a step back and make up your mind for yourself, but it has to be based in something here in objective reality, right? Like you can't read that poem and say, well, this poem is about a mom who she never wanted to have kids. Matter of fact, she never even wanted to get married. That's an interesting backstory for why she's just sort of standing there in the kitchen. But then my question, if a student says that in class, is going to be, okay, what are you basing that interpretation on, right? It's a fascinating sort of judgment that you're making. But unless it is grounded in something, I think that's the thing that we as a culture are missing, and it's the gap that education in its best form can help fill, I think.
So, a few final notes. If you're here visiting for blueprint credit, that check-in sheet is over there on that counter. Make sure that you're using your